Hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is basically when you're on high alert. So everywhere you go, you're scanning for threats. You're just pretty much very aware. Hyper aware is a good way to think of it for threats in your environment. So you can be easily startled, or someone touches you and it leads to like a big reaction. So that's what hypervigilance is. Exaggerated startle response, pretty much what we were just talking about. Problems with concentration, and this is another one that's very common if you've dealt with, if you're living with PTSD, like difficulty concentrating is a very, very common symptom. Sleep disturbance, for example, difficulty falling or staying asleep or restless sleep. So yeah, when you're sleeping, you're in a vulnerable state and your brain knows that. So, it's very understandable that your brain is going to try to keep you from having a deep sleep or from staying asleep, because it wants you to be alert for any potential threats to your safety. Or even, if you're having nightmares, then certainly that's going to lead to difficulty sleeping, because if that's what you're experiencing each night or most nights, yeah, you're going to feel quite anxious about the sleeping process. I also want to mention, actually, because I don't know that it's going to mention that here, but you may actually find that you're sleeping a lot more if you're living with PTSD, just because motivation to get up and go through life can be very difficult. So for some, they'd rather just sleep. They'd rather sleep, not think about what happened to them, not have to try to even engage with the day. So excessive sleeping could be another symptom. Okay, so those are the 6 that it mentions here. So you have to have at least 2 or more of those. Then duration of the disturbance in either of those criteria we talked about has to be more than 1 month. So this has to have been happening to you for more than a month. Anything less than a month, we call it an acute stress reaction, just because when you have a traumatic event, it's not uncommon for those things to happen to you, for you to experience these symptoms. We don't consider it PTSD though until it's been going on for more than a month. So the disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So basically, these symptoms have to be affecting different parts of your life. They need to affect your relationships, they need to affect you at work, affect you at school, things like that. Anything when it comes to mental health illness, mental health disorders, we always look at functioning, impairment to functioning. If it's not impairment to functioning, then you may just be feeling down. Because for example, with depression, we all feel sadness every now and then. But unless it's actually really impairing your function, we're likely not going to say you're suffering from depression. The disturbance is not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance, example, medication, alcohol, or any other medication. So some medications will result in some of these symptoms, and so if it's medication induced or drug induced, then it's not PTSD. That's pretty much what it's saying. So now the next part is talking about dissociative symptoms, okay, and it has to specify whether the symptoms meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, and in addition, in response to the stressor, the individual experiences persistent or recurrent symptoms of either of the 2 following. So now it's going to go into 2 specific types of dissociation symptoms. So depersonalization, persistent or recurrent experiences of feeling detached from and as if one were an outside observer of one's mental processes or body. Example, feeling as though one were in a dream, feeling a sense of unreality or of self or body or of time moving slowly. And I want to give you guys an example of where this can happen. Let's say you are living with PTSD from sexual assault, for instance. When you're now in a sexual encounter with someone else, let's say it's your spouse or a romantic partner, you may actually feel as though you're physically not in your body. You're actually observing yourself from the outside. Like maybe you're, at the top of the ceiling just watching this happen to you, for instance. So that could be what depersonalization can feel like. Derealization, persistent or recurrent experiences of unreality of surroundings. Example, the world around the individual is experienced as unreal, dreamlike, distant, or distorted. And so that's pretty much dreamlike, I think, is the best way to describe it. Derealization is when the world around you just doesn't feel real. It feels like you're in a dream. It's hard to really make sense of what's going on there. So that's what dissociation symptoms feel like, and they're very common PTSD symptoms. It's that emotional numbing. It's that feeling like you're not a part of your body. It's that feeling like detached from even the external world, and it doesn't even feel real. You also have to specify if some of the symptoms happened directly after the event, but some happened 6 months after the event. And it's one of those things that can happen with trauma reactions. After the event happens, you may feel like I'm not even fazed by it. And then next thing you know, months later, suddenly you're really feeling the impact of it. And when that happens, it can be really hard to understand. It can be really hard for people to make sense of, and it can be very distressing because it's like, where did this come from? I was fine. But it's really important to know that this is not abnormal. Okay, so that wraps up the symptoms of PTSD. But yeah, I want to kind of talk to you guys a bit more about how and why these symptoms occur the way that they do, to just kind of create some more clarity. So just to kind of talk about the sleep disturbances that happen with PTSD, because this is a very common one. First, I want to go into the excessive sleeping, just because I didn't see it covered in the DSM-5. But excessive sleeping, it really can be helpful to someone after a traumatic event, because it's a way to escape life, escape the way that you feel when you're awake, escape having to interact with the world, having to, just engage in life, because that can be very difficult after you've experienced some major trauma. For those that have difficulty sleeping, it's just important to know that the amygdala, it's a part of our brain, does tend to keep us awake, because our brain is perceiving that the world and our environment is not safe. And so it doesn't want us to be in a state of vulnerability, which is what we're in when we're sleeping, where we can't protect ourselves. It's saying you have to stay awake to keep yourself safe. And also, having nightmares each night certainly doesn't make sleeping pleasant. It can actually make someone anxious about falling asleep, because they know what's waiting for them on the other side. Some of the different emotions and mood that are associated with PTSD are, depression, anxiety, anger, helplessness, hopelessness, irritability. It's like, you just have a short fuse. You may feel a bit more impatient with people in your life and with situations. That's not uncommon. That hopelessness and that helplessness, feeling like you're not safe and not knowing that you can keep yourself safe, or that others in your life can keep you safe. Guilt and shame are also big ones. A lot of times we go through the would've, should've, could've, right? Like, what could I have done differently? What should I have done? And this is very common, because when we go through trauma, our brain really wants to process what happened. It wants to understand what happened, especially because a lot of traumatic events come to us unexpectedly. So, like, we may even replay dreams where it has a different outcome. So, kind of looking at anger, you may start to feel a lot of anger towards yourself, towards others, anger towards God, right? Like, questioning your worldview, questioning your existential views, questioning your sense of fairness, justice, especially if you are a survivor from, a traumatic event and you do go through the justice system, but you don't actually receive that justice. Or if you have this faith belief that nothing bad can happen to you because, God protects you. And then something like that happens, you start to question, well, God, why would you allow that to happen to me? And you start to feel this anger. And this can happen quite a bit if it's, even the loss of a loved one. Let's say you're in an accident with your child and your child dies. that could be another thing that leads to anger and questioning your existential beliefs and anger towards your higher power. And at the same time, you start to grieve. You start to grieve the loss of those beliefs, grieving the loss of, these values that you've held for your whole life. Grieving who you were, grieving the life that you had, grieving the loss of that sense of safety that you had in your environment. And in that grief, it's important to actually allow yourself to go through the grief process, the stages of grief. So that denial, bargaining, anger, depression, acceptance, it's important to allow yourself to grieve those losses. And so the guilt and the shame of the things that you feel that you should have done, could have done, would have done, feeling like you can't tell others or that you can't speak about what happened to you because deep down you're feeling like you're at fault for it. And when we're looking at that loss of that sense of self-efficacy, questioning our ability to keep ourselves safe, sometimes we may go to extreme measures, and not always extreme. Some are certainly, whatever you have to do to keep yourself safe, that's actually not a bad thing. So, for example, some will take self-defense classes, that's fine. Some will install home security systems, that's a good thing too, that's certainly helpful. Sometimes there are things that are very appropriate for you to do to give yourself a greater sense of safety, and that's definitely very good. It's very helpful. Another thing I really want to point out is, because in the DSM it talks about traumatic events that occur through violence or accidentally. And the reason why that's very important is because that is a big part of what results in PTSD symptoms. That's a big part of what results in our perception of something as traumatic and that difficulty in processing it and getting through it after the fact. Because when things like that happen, they're very unexpected. And when they're unexpected, it's difficult for us sometimes to really understand what precipitated that event. So let's say, for example, your trauma is from a car accident. Likely you would have been in many vehicles, driven many times, or been a passenger in a car many times and never had an accident. And you weren't drinking and driving, for instance. Let's say you're just kind of going on with your day. You're going to work like you do every day. And then suddenly this happens. When you can't really identify some of the precipitating factors, it can be very difficult to really process what happened to you. And it can then at that point make it, your triggers very overgeneralized. So your triggers can be cars, any car you see, just being in a car can become a trigger. Let's say you are the victim of a mugging, right? Let's say you've walked to the bank machine many times, and next thing you know, you're triggered by that particular street. You're triggered by bank machines. You're triggered by anyone walking behind you when you're walking down the street. You're triggered anytime you're walking alone down the street. There's become so many triggers because it's hard to really understand what it was that even led up to that experience that occurred to you. Or let's say you are the victim of a sexual assault, and let's say it was someone you may have spent plenty of time alone. Let's say you're female and you spent plenty of time alone with male friends and you've been fine. And then suddenly this happens. It can be really hard to understand how that happens. So now you're questioning whether or not you can trust anyone or even trust yourself. And so again, triggers become overgeneralized. And so kind of looking at the change in our belief systems. So our beliefs change because our brains need predictability. With life, there are so many complex processes that need to occur. And so our brains need some sort of predictability because it needs to keep us safe. Our brain doesn't want us to experience that traumatic event repeatedly. And so it basically, and it starts to create rules for living that are protective for us. Now, the difficulty with PTSD is that when our brain is so focused on, protecting against threats and keeping us safe, it can actually start to ignore cues that tell us our environment is actually safe, and it starts to try to control way too many things at that point, making it maladaptive. Our brain could be telling us that there's danger where none actually exists. And it's the same thing with the self-destructive behavior. Our brain is basically telling us that this is what it takes to numb the pain, distract ourselves, regain a sense of control. When really, if you're driving at top speeds, that's not going to really help you gain a sense of self-control. Substance abuse, even though temporarily it may feel like it's numbing the pain, it can actually lead to, addictions, things like that. The poor concentration we talked about as being a very common symptom of PTSD. Again, it goes back to that hypervigilance. So when we're so focused on looking for potential threats, then at that point, we're ignoring all non-pertinent information. So yeah, it's gonna be hard to really take in information that's not really focused on protecting against threats. So the thing that's really interesting about trauma, we have these particular fears that are common to all of us as human beings. Things like loss of control, death, fear of isolation, the unknown, fear of failure. A traumatic event can actually encompass all of those things, which can make it that much more impactful to our psyche. Okay guys, so that covers our explanation of what is PTSD, what are some of the symptoms, and why do we even have these symptoms. So at this point, you're gonna be wondering, well, if I have it, what can I do about it? There are actually a lot of different types of treatments for PTSD. Certainly not one that can be covered in a single video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be releasing individual videos about different types of treatment for PTSD. So please just keep a lookout for those. I'll make a PTSD playlist as well on my channel that you can refer to see any videos that I make specifically for PTSD treatment and therapy. But yeah, it's definitely not something we're going to be able to cover in one individual video. Also, I'm gonna make a part 2 of this video to just kind of explain a little bit more about PTSD. So guys, if you enjoyed this video and you wanna see more content about PTSD, then please hit the like button to let me know. I'll be happy to release more videos about it. Just going even a bit more in depth about the experience of PTSD, whether it's for you or for a loved one. Also, please subscribe to the channel and be sure to hit the bell icon to turn on your notifications. That way you'll know when I release new videos, whether about this particular subject or other mental health related matters. Also, if you know anyone that could really benefit from this video, please also share it. Also guys, any questions or comments are very welcome. I enjoy reading them, so if there's anything that stuck out for you or anything that you're curious about, please feel free to post that below as well. All right guys, so it was great chatting with you, and I will look forward to catching